And while we shouldn't be blinded by them, there are a number of other reasons for why the glass is half full. It's half full because the nations did sign up to the 2 degrees target. And it actually, and perhaps even more importantly, for the first time saw some of the world's major emerging economies agree to economy-wide emissions pledges in terms of intensity or the like, which is a prospect that would have been all but unthinkable in Australia a year or so ago. Now, the obvious caveat, of course, is that the commitments don't add up to 2 degrees, and analysis varies that they are 3 to 4 degrees or more. So we need to build ambition to actually make that target meaningful. And perhaps most importantly, they don't peak before 2020, which as I said before, is critical in the task of avoiding 2 degrees warming. But the glass is half full because there is significant and uncelebrated progress made on a number of other key fronts, including financing, forests and technology. And lastly, the glass is half full because of the surprisingly high levels of investment in clean technology, coming back to that Deutsche Bank report. Back in Bali, it was thought that a top-down agreement would actually be necessary to drive the global investment and trade in climate solutions, but the reality has been quite different. You just need to follow the money to see the emerging low-carbon political economy. A recent World Watch Institute report reported that in 2008, investment in new renewable energy power capacity exceeded coal, oil and gas technologies by some $30 billion worldwide. Developing countries have got a significant share of that, with China being the world's largest manufacturer now of solar photovoltaic technology and the second largest investor in the wind energy, closing in on the US in terms of investment. And Korea, which had invested 80% of its stimulus money, passed legislation that could lead to the introduction of emissions trading. Last week, the Pew Foundation released further reports backing this up, that even through the GFC in 2009, showed that clean energy investments since 2005 had increased 230%, and that in 2009, clean energy investments reached 162 billion, and were projected in 2010 with much more of the stimulus money starting to come through in other countries. They didn't do it as quick as we did here, coming through. These investments are being driven not only by concerns about climate change, of course, but also by other issues including energy security, transport and public health risks such as urban air quality. But they are also being driven by a strong eye on the commercial opportunities of this burgeoning multi-billion-dollar global market. Australian commentators caught up in the murky backwaters of recent political bloodletting have failed to recognise the extent to which Australia is being left behind in this burgeoning clean energy economy. A surprising insight into this new race for low-carbon competitiveness came at the recent Davos meeting from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who said, 6 months ago, my biggest worry was that an emissions deal would make American business, sorry, it's very transferable, American business less competitive compared to China. Now my concern is that every day we delay trying to find a price for carbon is a day that China dominates the green economy. Now, just as for national climate action commitments, these level of investments are substantial, but not yet sufficient in deploying technologies at the scale needed. What then is needed to fill the rest of the glass? Filling the glass requires building momentum, trust and ambition. Firstly, and most critically, developed countries need to honour the commitments that they've made regarding the financing. Secondly, we need a new approach to the multilateralism, its forums and its factions. There's no case for abandoning the UNFCCC as terminally flawed. It will remain at least the main discussion forum internationally and the only forum that allows for a voice for the vulnerable, the small island states or the poorer countries of Africa, all excluded to date from the G20 and their ilk. It's also very unlikely that the basics, or indeed others, will easily allow their veto power in that consensus framework to be at least cheaply usurped. It's also clear that after the, but it is clear that after the bruising of Copenhagen, that the consensus-driven UNFCCC forum is not the only place to build ambition of the world's largest emitters. It can be a place for building crucial momentum and trust, and immediate focus should be on progressing action in areas that are close to conclusion and essential to building trust. And these can be in those measures I mentioned of deforestation, of technology, of long-term finance. The measuring, reporting and verification of national emissions reduction targets will likely be a, or if not the, most hotly contested issue here and elsewhere. It's crucial in those negotiations that countries don't slump back into the trenches of the old negotiating factions. Behind the scenes, Copenhagen actually gave birth to some new forums and factions. It gave birth to a new forum, not a negotiating bloc, but a forum for progressive-minded countries across all continents, and which freed them from caucus requirements and enabled them to share ideas. This will be very important to continue to support at the UNFCCC and other meetings. It's also likely, and there were signs of this in Copenhagen, that new forums or alignments will emerge between the EU and the umbrella developed group countries in response to the emergence of the basic group. To the extent that this is focused on building ambition, this is a healthy thing. In reality, building ambition will come back to the world leaders making the necessary decisions. In the immediate aftermath of Copenhagen, this is more likely to be in the smaller leader-led forums as opposed to the minister-led ones like the UNFCCC, but leader-led forums like the G20 or the Major Economies Forum. But if they are serious, they're actually going to need to provide a voice, or at least a representative voice of the vulnerable countries at these meetings. The G20, for example, made something of a start on climate change issues this last year. They, for example, agreed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Progress on phasing out these subsidies will be critical to building confidence in the G20 as a forum and helping underpin the clean energy economic recovery. Other forums, such as the Major Economies Forum, first started by George Bush and John Howard, then adopted and adapted by Rudd and Obama, could be a venue for progressing technology cooperation and perhaps sectoral agreements in areas like aluminium or steel. Other forums will also need to be avenues for progress. The World Trade Organisation's relevance will only grow as talk of border tax adjustments and other initiatives such as India's proposed levy on coal imports to pay for clean energy investments grow. Not sure if you realise that, but a few weeks ago this was announced by India. Here's a tax on coal for clean energy, and I didn't hear a single miner make a squeak about that. It was quite remarkable. However, so there are issues there that are emerging in the trade area, and the successes that the WTO has had over the years can be built upon. Other forums like the International Energy Agency can be important for growing the trust and mechanisms for monitoring and reporting. Finally, filling the glass requires, now more than ever, stronger domestic policies that help build momentum, trust and ambition. Ultimately, what matters is that countries don't just commit to domestic action, they must also deliver. Significant progress internationally is tied to significant progress domestically. The opposite is also true, and to break this dichotomy we need credible policies. It means credible, internationally transparent policies that limit and price climate pollution. Now, the Coalition this year has reaffirmed its support for the government's target range of reducing 2000 pollution levels by 5 to 25% by 2020, and the conditions of comparative global effort that go with that range. But their direct action plans lacks credibility internationally because it offers no certainty that even the 5% target can be achieved. It also relies heavily on uncertain and as yet non-internationally compliant soil carbon offsets and provides nothing to build confidence in emerging global carbon markets. The government's CPRS does have the potential to get there, but the government this year introduced new conditions to moving beyond 5%. This shifting of the goalposts is most unhelpful in building trust, momentum or ambition and raises questions about their support for the Copenhagen outcomes. The move also flies in the face of all other independent analysis done to date on the government's global conditions, which say that the global action committed to date matches up to at least the 15% target by 2020. Credible domestic policies also require incentives for investment in clean technologies. The government has been far from stellar, but movements in renewable energy and energy efficiency provide opportunities in that regard. And of course the May budget will be crucial about whether it will deliver the some 600 million or so we need to be our fair share of that fast start money. And that could be delivered even with a surplus if the government honours even just a part of its G20 commitment of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies like fuel and diesel tax credits or fringe benefits for company car use. How actively and ambitiously these policies and more link with our foreign policy will also be a crucial test. Australia needs to be engaging and supporting action across the new factions and new forums mentioned earlier. Australia could also, for example, sponsor early technical reviews of how close global commitments into the Accord come to avoiding warming of the 2 degrees target. Performance on all of these will help provide an answer to the second of my questions asked at the outset, whether Australia can be creative and committed enough to be constructive. The other question I asked is whether an all-embracing legally binding treaty is possible or required to the stronger ambition and action needed. The stark reality is that it's too early to tell. It would appear that forcing 196 world leaders back into a closed hall would be anything but toxic to driving further ambition. But perhaps by building on the cooperative pledges made in the Accord and those nearly achieved at Copenhagen, can combine with the accelerating race for competitiveness in clean technology and climate solutions to mean that a full treaty may in fact not be necessary. But the goal of a binding treaty shouldn't be abandoned at this stage, however, in our view, and our Prime Minister should be building ambition and investments towards this at leaders' meetings this year and next. Above all else, a treaty can lock in commitments which transcend election cycles and can also give countries the certainty they need to establish strong domestic policy. In concluding, it's clear that combining our cooperative instincts and our competitive reflexes has never been more crucial or more challenging. I am, though, by profession, spirit and now necessity, an optimist. The alternatives help none. Copenhagen shattered the holy grail of an ambitious and binding treaty, or even a short and clear track to one. But perhaps it is better that we have to rely on more earthly vessels. For reasons I hope I've explained, you can take a glass-half-full approach to the current global climate realpolitik, not just because it's the only one we've got, but because the actions emerging are significant as we come out of the shadows of Copenhagen. The glass is half full, let's fill it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Look, it's a wonderful contrast to hear an optimist, because being foreign policy scholars at the Lowy Institute, we tend towards the pessimistic side. So it's a relief and a nice change to hear that. Let me ask you though, I'll talk a bit more about your speech at the end, but let me just kick it off by asking you this question. Are you really as optimistic as you claim to be when you look at the two countries that you described as the G2, the United States and China? You said, I think, that they more than anyone else have the ability to craft the outcomes we need. I take your point certainly on Chinese investment in clean technology, and that's driving the Americans in that direction too. But when you look at the sort of the landscapes in the US and China, both domestically and how they behaved at Copenhagen, are you really confident and optimistic that they can rise above both the sort of the free rider problem of refusing to take pain themselves in the interests of the global system, and also the long-term, short-term problem where leaders tend to be reluctant to take short-term pain in order to avoid long-term pain, even if it's greater? So thinking about the G20 and the US and China, is the glass really as full as you say, John?
Look, I mean, I don't want to be naive about it. I mean, it's tough, it's no question. It's a landscape littered with challenges. I guess there's no point though just focusing on those challenges. It's trying to work and find the clear path to those solutions, and understanding what is actually behind that is actually the only way we're going to surmount those challenges. But no, I mean, there's all sorts of difficult obstacles and things that can fall, but I think it's important though to at least understand from the wells from which we will draw to actually fill the glass.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Lady in the front.
Thanks very much. It was a great presentation. I want to ask you where you think the Australian electorate sits in this debate. Is it in the glass? Is it down the bottom, up the top? And how does it get dragged along in this, given that if you're going to be optimistic, it's going to be very important to have the electorate behind this?
That's a very good question, and we're having a bit of a look at that right now, in fact, and so we'll actually literally in the middle of some research about what Australian attitudes are, and we'll release those probably in a month or so.
Give us a hint, John.
But well, let's look to some of the other polls that are out there. Then there was a news poll a couple of weeks ago which showed that we still had 74% believing in global warming, I see 90-odd% of those that it was caused by humans. 57% supported an ETS even after the shattering of the bipartisan consensus. I mean, these are numbers that Garneau said he would have died for in the tariff debate. So there's actually quite a strong sentiment there and a need for action. And I think Australians, at the core of it, care very deeply for their environment. I'm not sure if they've quite made the links about the actual threats and opportunities in terms of the competitiveness in our economy and jobs. That's perhaps part of the challenge we need to make.
This gentleman here with the microphone.
I'd like to take up the domestic political question and also the American one. I've read of a couple of bills being tried out in the US to suggest something simpler than the CPRS that we had here and the similar one that Obama's had there. They got very complicated and incomprehensible because, in both cases, because of various concessions that have been made. One of these is a proposal to have an ETS limited to the electricity sector, which is a very big chunk of the entire thing. Another one was a carbon tax, every cent of which would be rebated to individuals on a per capita basis, adult individuals, most of whom, I suppose all Democrats, or nearly all, will be better off. So I'm wondering whether some simplifying device like this might help get something to happen.
You know what I reckon when we see what's just about to emerge out of Lindsey Graham and John Kerry's compromise process, which is one of which is it's not only just limiting having some sort of approach, whether it's emissions trading or emissions intensity for the generators. The talk is of having some linked price mechanism to that for transport, having something else for some manufacturers, having something else for someone else, again, in some other sector. I actually think people are going to go back, gee, the ETS actually looks pretty simple to me. Because at its core, it is a simple thing. It actually makes the biggest polluters pay a price and buy permits and trade that. The complexities arose out of the political compromises that did come. And so, look, I think I'm actually going to be very interested when we actually see some of these things hit the table, and there's some ideas about that emerging now, but I think people might go, whew, that's pretty complex, and it's certainly complex for business.
While we're waiting for the next question, let me press you a bit on China, if I can, John. You were very even-handed in your dealings on China, but tell us a bit about the atmospherics in the hall around some of the snubs to Obama and the muscularity of Chinese behaviour, because of course this goes much more widely than climate change policy. I mean, we're starting to see this on a range of different foreign policy issues. So did it jerk people's heads back that they were behaving in quite as forthright a manner in which they did? I mean, one can imagine what the Chinese reaction would have been if President Obama had done some of the protocol sort of snubs to their Prime Minister that he did to Obama. So what was the atmospherics in the hall about that?
Look, I mean, it was all focused on the assertiveness and the aggression. There's no question. It's only subsequent that we've just discovered some of these nuances, and actually speaking to some of our colleagues in China to go, hang on, this was also at play. There are power tussles going on in various factions in China about this, and as I said, you know, there's a belief about this conspiracy or even concern about how far the low carbon pathway can take it in the quest for harmony and stability. So, but in the hall, no question that the feeling was that this was aggression and the like, but that's also partly because I'm absorbing the more Western media that was also perhaps taking that filter to the talks as well.
And was there a sense that the sort of consensus between China and the G77, you touched on this, was breaking a little bit? That there are members of the non-aligned movement who were really pushing back against China?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, and one negotiator said it was almost like they were a wounded bull, the G77, because they were sort of roaming around and people weren't clear where they were coming. So it's actually, it is historic. If I didn't make the emphasis enough in the speech, it is historic, the sort of tearing in that faction, and I think it's healthy for that to be a little looser. As I said, to allow some of the more constructive ideas that Mexico and others were coming forward with to bloom.
Lady down the front.
You made a very important point about institutional failure and how in the aftermath of the consensus or non-consensus that the World Trade Organization's role will be strengthened or bolstered. However, did you find any support for the idea of establishing a new multilateral institution such as a World Environmental Organization?
There's certainly talk about that. I mean, one of the key things I think is going to be actually some of the institutions of how they're delivering some of this finance, and that's where there's going to be a lot of talk. But I think, we just come back to this question about consensus-based things under the UN and those things as to other institutional apparatus, the G20s and the like, or to improving the institutions of the World Bank and the like, where they've been experimenting with some better committees which have better governance, parity for the use of some of those funds. But I think this is a debate that's going to rage on for the next couple of years.
Harley Wright.
John, Harley Wright question. Emission trading. In Europe, there's billions of dollars traded annually in emission permits. Where do you see emission permits going now, particularly with the new promises, I think post-Copenhagen, in the promises that were made at the end of January? Do you see those being translated into, what I call it, targets for individual countries and providing the legal necessity that you require for emission permits to be, or emission units to be, a tradable commodity with the sort of stature and stability of things like treasury notes, which is what they're becoming?
Well, there are questions obviously after 2012 with the concerns around Kyoto, first commitment period ending, and what does that mean for the global carbon market. I think the reality will be whatever domestic trading schemes there are will be ones that will be keeping that alive, and the EU is the most robust. And I think it's withstood a number of the challenges and a number of the questions that's been put to it, but it certainly needed improvement. I think the Australian scheme was an improvement. But it will depend, obviously, now just around the domestic processes and what does emerge out of the US political mince machine.
But John, back on the Australian scene, can I ask you to project forward after the next election? How do you think the debate's likely to play out? If the opposition wins, then is the sort of direct action model that they are advocating, is that really sustainable in light of the defects that you and Garneau and various other critics have pointed to? And so how might that debate develop within a coalition government? And equally on the Labor side, if Labor is re-elected, where do you see that going? Are they likely to pick up the ETS? Is it a matter of then trying to squeeze that through a reconfigured Senate, or where might it go?
Good questions. I'm not sure if Centrebet's running some odds on this, but look, it's very complex. Obviously, with the coalitions policy, they've started to talk about, we might need one in 2015, an emissions trading scheme and the like. And I think this debate has just got to grow up. We need something which puts a limit and a price on climate pollution. And I think it will, and I think business are actually will eventually demand that. We know actually that they were calling the coalition offices in late November and December, trying to get the thing through. And we know that all the companies, all the miners who, by the way, who said that the sky was going to fall in, obviously sort of gone on pretty happily since the CPR has failed. And we know that they've all got shadow prices. We know that the big banks are all developing their packages with the knowledge that in 3 to 5 years at least there'll be some form of carbon price. So I think it's better that we get that on with sooner or later, and those pressures will build up, I think, around it, whether it's the government or the coalition. The key question is, will it be enough to build the ambition towards an effective climate solution or not?
We've got time for a couple more questions. So yes, gentleman here in the middle, on the end.
This might be a very small issue. You said government should grow up. Could they grow up by not supporting Formula One and the like? And does the Climate Institute have a view on Formula One and the like?
No, we haven't got a formal position on that. I'm certainly not a rev head. I wouldn't mind if it's some of these electric cars start going, because I'm told that they actually can be faster than many of the petrol-based ones. And it may remove the drama of the pit stop, I guess, but seriously, actually, that's an area where Australia is also being well behind the game. This is so aggressively pursued, this emerging electric car market globally, and we are one of the poorest in actually thinking about this and what it means for our grids and our electricity distribution as well. So I've bridged your question into an alternative investment solution.
There are the germs of a beginning, though, in terms of electric cars in Australia, aren't there? Is it Better Place that's trying to set up? Is it a market in Canberra? Am I right? Or
Yeah, they're some very very well thought through plans and linking into overseas rollout. And their plan is, I think, next year to start in Canberra, but then roll it out to stations in Melbourne and Sydney. So that's definitely the case. I mean, they've got a very solid business model. Evan Thornley tells me, he says, look, we actually don't even need a carbon price, I'll just tell you quietly. He said, perhaps we should strike while the iron is cold, I think he said, and to get some better support for their things, because just the prices of batteries are coming down and the price of fuel is obviously going to go up. So they've got some pretty well thought through business models on this.
Okay. Final question from the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. On the ETS, would it not be the case that the Australian market is simply too small to have an efficient ETS, and would it not be better to link it to, for instance, the European ETS system, provide more business opportunities for trading? Thanks.
Look, I think it can be substantial enough, but it's the point of having the linkages, which is important, and in fact actually important to the ambition of the overall goal. Whilst I think there's been some ridiculous criticisms of the ETS in terms of the extent of which there'll be international offsets that come into the Australian market, the Treasury modelling and other analysis shows that would be no more than 15 to 25%. That actually is a very important safety valve or inspiration for extra ambition, because it can allow some moderation of the prices. But I think it would certainly be robust enough. No one ever complained about that in the debate, that would be too small, but there's obvious advantages in linking.
Wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you in a second to thank John? John, I think, can I compliment you on giving us a speech that was both very substantive, with really a well thought out sort of explanation for those of us who are not following it every single day on the events at Copenhagen and what's followed and what it means for geopolitics, and also for giving us some of the atmospherics of Copenhagen, or Hypenhagen as you called it, and the organic apple carts and all the rest of it. So we appreciate both the light and the dark. So thank you, John Connor.
Thank you.